Hello, everyone. This next conversation will be held in English. We have esteemed experts from the fields of art and technology flown in from the United States. I'd like to kick off this conversation and just jump right in it and present our speakers. Let's start off with Matthias Röder, Managing Director at the Karajan Institute.
Hi.
Then we have Regina Harsanyi, Associate Curator of Media Arts at the Museum of the Moving Image in New York City. Welcome, Regina. Lastly, Andrew Blanton, Associate Professor of New Media Art in the CADRE Media Labs in San Jose State University and a Ph.D. candidate at the Center for New Music and Audio Technologies at the University of California, Berkeley. My name is Clara Blume. I'll be moderating this conversation. Until very recently, I led Austria's first lab for artificial creativity in Silicon Valley. So this conversation is going to be around the topic of artificial creativity and the future of art. I dare say this is a very exciting, fascinating, and terrifying moment to work in the arts. A lot of questions to ask. Not so many to answer, and we have a lot of ground to cover, so no introduction needed. I'm going to start us off with a lightning round and ask each panelist about this interesting question of creativity. Formerly known one of the main concepts to define our humanity. Now it has become common sense to speak of artificial creativity, and everyone is kind of just taking it for granted. So I'm going to start off with our first panelist here, who has been in this business for quite some time and playing around with creative algorithms. So if I ask you directly, do you think an algorithm can be creative? And if so, how and why?
Yeah, I think it's totally possible. I think we see a lot of creativity coming from machines, broadly spoken. Creativity is not really so special. It's, creating something new that is useful in a certain situation. I think we humans have been really great of putting creativity up there on some kind of pedestal and, creating religions around creativity, which I believe is not necessary. We can have a very simple and practical look at creativity, and then, of course, machines can be creative.
All right, what's your take on this, Regina?
Well, I already think about the engineers who are behind a lot of these algorithms as creative in themselves. Their bias already on what ends up being used when it's generated by, say, artists is a creative act. It's like they're humans that are branding like whatever this algorithm ends up being. And then there's an artist, So-Wen Chung, who is a great example maybe for this question, because she not only works with machine learning, but she makes robots that use artificial intelligence that she draws with. So she's answering that question herself by co-creating with that this robot that uses these algorithms. And of course, like the algorithms themselves, in contrast with the artists, are creative because it's about using artists to subvert the technology. So.
Oh, there's a lot of interesting things in that comment, as well as Matthias, but let's continue the lightning round with Andrew.
I guess my question is, what is creativity? And what do you mean to define this, right? Because that's a really big word.
This is what we're here for. This is the entirety of this discussion to, tackle that question, nothing more.
Yeah. So, I certainly see, software development in this type of space as a creative action for sure. And in my practice, that's really the thing that I work toward. But I guess, thinking in terms of the ability to synthesize on its own in a way to really build out of nothing. I'm not sure that that's maybe if that's what we're defining as creativity. I don't know that that's attainable yet in certain ways without a training set to start from. So then it's a question of what does creativity mean in this context, and are we really building tools that assist humans in whatever thing they're doing? And that's kind of the way that I see these spaces. as just an evolution of, what's already come before.
All right, so we have, on the one hand, the take that creativity is overestimated anyways. It's one of those concepts that we put up there on the pedestal saying, well, this defines us, this makes us special as a species. Then we have the engineers who essentially see themselves as creators and want to be seen as creators and thus define their algorithms as creative. And then we have the entire questioning of what is creativity anyways and can it be obtained? I love it. So, so much ground to cover. I'm going to keep this as orderly as I can, even though I think we should just have a friendly conversation, but without distracting us too much, let's lean a little bit more into creativity question. And we're going to start off again with Matthias, who has been building, working, curating, asking questions around AI for a very long time, and you have in fact curated lots of very prominent projects at the intersection of algorithmic creativity and human creativity. So what are the lessons learned? What is the leap forward that we've just made with this new ChatGPT that has just come out? How would you define this journey?
Well, maybe to give a little bit of context, in the last 3 years, I was directing and leading a team that created a completion of the 10th Symphony of Ludwig van Beethoven. Beethoven, left us with 40 sketches, which is quite considerable. He hadn't started composing this work, and the idea was to say, can a artificial neural network that has been trained on music of the time and music of Ludwig van Beethoven in particular, can it be of any help to make sense of these sketches in a way that we as human creators would not put in our own personal style, our own interpretation of what the sketches meant, but rather, complete those sketches with what one could consider Beethoven's own style. And on the surface, this sounds like a very simple project, and straightforward, but there were a lot of issues to overcome. And there was also a lot of, I'd say, reservation from the side of the public why something like this would even be necessary to do. We did it nevertheless because we felt that it's important to use the technology to push the boundaries of what we can do. And as a musicologist myself, I always felt that it would be really interesting to explore this field of musical ideas that Beethoven had not realized yet. Because when you look at the way that he composed, you see him struggle a lot with the material. Composing did not come easy to Beethoven. And so I felt like we almost had a moral obligation to try it out. and by the way, I'm convinced that if someone like Beethoven was still alive today, they would probably have a group of technologists working with them, trying to create the next, wave of technologies. Now, this all happened in 2019 to 21. And that was way before the general public had any sense of how powerful GPT-3 would be. This came later. And I always say, this project had a massive impact on a global scale. For Deutsche Telekom was actually had the idea for the project and was the sponsor of the project. They measured earned media of over 700 million euros, which is unbelievable. It means they would have had to spend 750 million euros to get the same kind of exposure, which is mind-blowing. But I think today, when we would do something like this, everyone would say, well, that's, of course, a computer can do that. I mean, we all know that it's possible. It's nothing special anymore. And I think this is really indicative of the pace that we are dealing with and sort of also this contemporaneity of what the technology can do and what the public knows the technology can do.
Oh, that's a beautiful summary and a very, very good way to segue into the next question that still teeters on this question of creativity. Regina, so would you say, and I like to be polemic here, but do you think that AI truly possesses artistic creativity or artistic qualities, or is it essentially just mimicking, and I think this is also an interesting question to ask in the context of the Beethoven piece, just mimicking or replicating existing artistic styles or techniques?
Of course, it's not just mimicking existing styles or techniques. I think that's a very narrow window of thinking about AI. I feel like that question almost comes from considering just GAN artwork, which is incredibly visual. And there's
can you explain briefly for the audience?
It's a generative adversarial network. It's taking images, you feed it a bunch of images, and then you ask it, to make a dog, and it'll make a dog in its own kind of way based on the images that it's been trained on. But a lot of the artwork that's coming out now, and has been coming out since the 2010s, is that, and I think that's also what most people think about when they hear about artificial intelligence and art. And so that question that keeps coming up, it's a common question, comes out of just thinking about GAN artwork. But there's so many other ways that artists are employing machine learning, and that has nothing to do with GAN. So there are artists I have a bunch I wrote down, even, it was a rule-based system, but in the 80s, Chris Marker made a chatbot called a memory that was using AI. So you have these text-based works, or there's Ken Feingold made If Then, where he created these two robot heads that were talking to each other using algorithms. You have this, it's a sculptural piece, right? There's so much more sculptural artwork that includes AI and this. And there's so many artists that are making work about predictive policing, and predictive policing is using, you have an image that draws a square around a person based on data that's tracking them to see if they will be murdered or something, or drones. And there's
I can't
artists
think
who
of
are,
any ways to abuse
there are
technology.
artists who are employing that to make commentary on predictive policing, which that wouldn't even exist without AI, right? You have Lynn Hirschman Leeson making works on that, and you have this piece called I wrote this down. You have this piece called Future Wake that won awards and went to immersive festivals all about this topic. And Zach Blass is making many works right now that are commenting on the creativity, I guess, that's very specific to AI, right? Yeah. You have this whole work that's about creating a mesh of your data and then using that mesh to whip yourself with it, because it's taking your own data, and then these companies that use machine learning are basically hurting you with it now. So
a lot of artistic commentary.
Yeah, so that has nothing to do with GANs, and there's a platform called Brain Drops, and it's also related to blockchain. All they put out is and I like Mario Kligman. He's been working with machine learning for a long time, but now so many of the artworks look just like that. And they even had a project on this platform called Brain Drops called All AI Art Looks the Same, and it was a group project, and they did it sarcastically to say that all GAN work doesn't look the same. And it did. I think it all still looked the same. I don't think they proved their argument, but that is to say.
But may I have a follow-up question here that we can then also hand over to Andrew? Thanks to the incredible impact that ChatGPT had on all of us, and is going to make all of us redundant. No, I'm just joking. Or am I? But now this technology has been accessible to all of us, not just the chosen few who work in the arts, who experiment with it, who have the capabilities, the server power and or the financial means to make this work. How do you see that impacting the broader artistic scape? We've had the fake Drake track that I'm sure all of you have been privy to and or listened, that emulates Drake's voice, and it went viral, and nothing new. It happened also to The Weeknd. But now you have this technology, it's out of the box, it's accessible to everyone. How will this reshape artistic content creation as a whole? And each time a technology gets, let's say, superfluous or spread around the public, it has a huge impact on the market, the art market, on museum culture, on the tradition of education in the arts, and ultimately on our awareness how we can define art itself. So the proliferation of art.
Yeah, I think I'll. So I guess into getting into that in that space, I have a question for the audience, really in general, and that's how many people in the room have used AI within the last week? Yeah, that's interesting, right?
To write their own moderation cards, maybe?
Yeah, and so I think it's this rising tide, right, of augmenting sort of standard performance or practice, like in daily life, right, whether you're an artist or not, and that's just a tool set that's growing. And so I think, somewhat to Regina's point too, deeply within the history of media art has been embedded this dialogue and critique of technologies and how we as humans interact with technology and how we use technology in our daily lives, right? This is fundamental to the dialogue and the conversation within the new media art community and practice. And that space becomes really important, I think, in thinking in terms of how we're all in our lives are being affected directly by this technology in both good and negative ways, right? That's true. It's with a very powerful platform comes both dangers and benefits, right? So this is a part of the dialogue as well. It's not so nuanced, it's not so black and white. But to this point, I think there is a space to consider, well, so yeah, we do have the DALL-E's, right, and I think ChatGPT is more interesting because it's like natural language processing, so it has more outputs. But the deep dream stuff that happened earlier was all very sterile in a way that wasn't really artistic. What I would say, it's not really an artistic. They're not art platforms really. But
you have Midjourney, you have DeviantArt, you have like so many platforms where those tools are accessible, and then let's not even dive into music. I mean,
right. Well, this is so the dream of like Pierre Boulez at URCAM was really to be able to augment performances and build massive performance spaces, right? So when we see projects like Orchidea, right, by Carmenecella, I think that's
every time I will find you guys. Every time you raise an artist without giving context, I'm going to take away one question from each of you. So
Orchidea, like one of my friends might get upset with me if I said, oh, you can feed it sound files and it will give you a targeted orchestration, or you give it a target rather, and it will give you a solution of an orchestrated file, right? If that makes sense, if we can speak in those terms. But you could feed it like a sound file and it will give you an orchestration out. Say, for instance, I want to write for flute, clarinet, bassoon, right? And I give it a bird song. It can then produce a orchestration of that, which I might have a bit of a critique to the Beethoven's 10th thing. My first question is, well, why not have somebody who has really good orchestration chops just do it? Because it's going to cost way less than a team of engineers training for it, and it probably won't have orchestration errors in the trumpets.
This gets really juicy. I didn't expect that.
just
Coming
by the
from
by.
The right
Sorry.
Flank.
Yeah. Basically, first of all, why not do something else? Well, you can always ask that question. My answer is why not? No, just to clarify, we were a team of composers, music theorists, and computer scientists working together on this. And in fact, the orchestration engine was something that we could only do because COVID came along and there was a long delay with the actual performance, which couldn't happen due to the pandemic. And so we had more time at hand and we said, like, so why not actually try and see if we can do an orchestration engine? And we started doing that and we were quite hopeful, but it wasn't there really. So we said, well, then let's do the following. Instead of having a human orchestrate the whole thing, which was the initial plan, let's let the machine take a shot at it. And we know it is not sufficient yet. It still makes a lot of mistakes. But let's try and retain sort of some of the ideas that come from the computer. So, that was something that was exciting, and it was really a mix between human and machine creativity, if you want to put it like that. And the result was then very good and very interesting, and something that people like to talk about. So for us, the idea was really to push the boundaries. And I think, there's a long history of people trying to push the boundaries, even though you can do it better the traditional way. But the idea is, of course, that at some point, the new way will supersede the traditional way, which I think is a point that we have now crossed in many disciplines.
Yeah, so this is really the to wrap up the thought that Clara started, right, in talking about how these technologies are changing practices and how they happen. This is, I guess, to the point that a lot of people in this room are using these technologies to augment the normal tasks that they do. And that's what I see as the normalization of AIs, and AIs working in conjunction with artists to buttress and augment their practices.
And I like that normalization of AI. I'm going to ask that question to you, Regina, unless you want to, you need something
I was
you
just
get.
going to say that I really do think it's about the relationship between artists and machine learning working together. And I thought of another example. I actually curated a show in 2018 that involved...
Unless it's your work.
It's not. It's an artist, Damiansky, who actually was one of the first artists who got me interested in GPT. I think it was still GPT-2, maybe 3 at the time. I think we launched the project in 2019. But basically, similar in a weird way to the Rafik that's at MoMA right now, Anadol piece, which I think most of you know about, hopefully.
Most publicized piece ever.
Damiansky, what he did in 2018 was he created a data set of all of MoMA's press releases, but how it worked is you walked up to it and you put on a headset and a microphone and you said whatever you asked it a question, and it would use the press releases to generate like a poem about whatever you spoke about. So in that case, like the machine learning algorithm is being creative. It's taking this data set and it's working with the visitor and it's working with the artist to create something.
All right, let me follow up on that in a slightly different way. So now that AI is omnipresent, accessible to everyone, we speak of the democratization of artificial intelligence, right? Getting this tool to everyone. But art is also about, and we have to be frank here, about access, about being limited, of being limited resources given to limited few people that do things with it. So if this technology is out there, accessible to everyone, and everyone comes up with new music tracks with AI-generated tools and lots of plugins, or you have generative AI exhibitions done by, say, amateurs, can we still call it art?
May I jump in? Because I really disagree.
I am not surprised, and I wonder why I asked this question.
I mainly disagree from sort of a point of music, right? I think music is something that we all have. We all can sing, we can clap a rhythm, we can dance. Some of you may say, I really can't dance, but of course you can. Music is an art form that we humans possess collectively. And I think a lot of music making has been collective music making with very, very little barriers, actually. When you look at the production process of music nowadays, especially in commercial music, you know, for the last 20, 30 years, the influence of high-tech in studios and so on has continuously decreased. More and more music albums have actually been produced in bedrooms, you know, cellars and so on. And this democratization has been going on for a long time. It has not really damaged music making. On the contrary, I think it led to a blooming of musical culture. And I think this is really, really helpful. And
yes and no.
And I think this idea of exclusivity in music is not really a big factor anymore.
Okay.
I
Regina?
disagree for such a different reason, and it's that I don't think that it's accessible at all. And the reason is because you need supercomputers, like you need a lot of computational power to be able to generate the kind of answers that ChatGPT is doing, or DALL-E, and all these products that we're interfacing with. And when you're a creative, when you're an artist, to have access to, and there are many artists working with this, to make their own data set that can calculate and compute at the level of these centralized companies, it's incredibly inaccessible. It requires so many resources. Often these things are proprietary, not always. Like Stable Diffusion is one of them. They're not proprietary. But when you think about OpenAI and ChatGPT, like, we don't have access to those data sets. We don't have access to that computation. So on the surface, things might seem accessible, but I think they're very much not.
Yes and no, also to that comment. I'm going to let Andrew take this one first and then segue to all of them.
Yeah, I just think I have I think it's also sort of political as to whether people are being sort of expert users of a software or if they actually understand what's going on. So it's a different thing to, build your own custom stable diffusion stack or, like a Hugging Face stack or something like this, and being able to train data sets and get that to actually work versus, going to OpenAI and ChatGPT and typing something in, or, DALL-E or something, and getting an output that that's ultimately like a relationship with the software as a end user, which I would say you're probably more of the product of Microsoft as opposed to an actual enabled user.
So let me give my 10 cents to all of your answers, and then tackle the next big block about copyright and this beautiful white canvas that we have in front of us where no one really knows where it's going. To your point about democratization of music, especially, I'm a musician myself, and the way I've perceived this is, yes, everyone has done like a gazillion records in their garage, and we have all those tools, and it's really low cost. But at the same time, the democratization of the arts has led to a prolificacy of new artworks, but it's still a monopolization of who can share that art, right? You have those online platforms like Spotify where you put it on, but you're never compensated for it. So we also created a culture of, where artists have no longer been compensated for anything, also because the threshold of being an artist is so low now. So by the sheer numbers game, you have a gazillion artists who all want to be on Spotify. Clearly, you can't pay all of them. So here we go again about the elitism of arts and access. It's a very, very delicate balance. To your point about access, I completely agree. You have those data sets, and they are in the hands of the few. And as we now have learned with Sam Altman, this is how it's supposed to be and shall remain. But clearly, artists have fought against this. But then we need to ask the question, like, is someone who plays with DALL-E, which is an image generating tool by OpenAI, just for the general public. And they come up with something really interesting, and that's open access. Can that be considered art? Is anyone who does that in their bedroom an artist now? Where do we draw the line? And then lastly, yes, to the question of access. Some create open source tools, and we need to tackle the question whether this is desirable, if we want to do this, if we want to aspire to do this, and if we want to pressure political decision makers and regulators to enforce this and make sure that we don't have a monopolization of these powers, right? Anyone wants to say something to those points I just raised, or should we?
Yeah, I think anyone can do art. Emphatically, yes. And if we are living in a society in which some people say, you cannot be an artist, I think that would be terrible. So I think everyone can be an artist, and I think today is a much better time of becoming the artist you want to be than 100 years ago or 200 years ago. So this is regardless of technology or not, And I also believe we can have technology in the mix or not. There will be art with or without technology, but I really, truly believe we can all be artists if we want to be. And there should be no one keeping us from it.
Regina?
Art education's important. Everybody at a young age should be learning to make art and learn how to be creative. And, from a curatorial perspective, we say most art is bad art. Like the art that we want to show is always going to be the art that rises to the top and is conceptual and thoughtful and is skilled in all these things. But it doesn't mean that you're not an artist if you're not showing in a museum. And it has nothing to do with technology. It's the same thing.
Amen to that. Andrew?
I just think to your point, I saw this statement by Bruce Sterling come out that he said, just be prepared for the wave of bad art that's coming. It's like, just wait for it. No.
Okay. As a curator, it's really hard to just weed through all.
It's always been bad.
Yeah, it is always. You're right. Sorry, but I'm going to gear us towards the next topic. I briefly touched on the topic of music and this Drake track, and I'm following back up on this because it was so prominently featured in public media, and some of you might even have listened to the track. It's uncanny. The Weeknd track is pretty bad, but this one, the Drake track, is pretty rad. So let's talk about originality, authorship, and copyright. And I'm really curious to see how you have stumbled upon some of these questions in your own artistic practice, curatorial practice, and educational practice. And I won't narrow that question down. I'm just going to leave it as open as is. Who wants to go first? Regina, come on.
So I know that artists are really concerned about this right now, especially when they don't have access to the data set, which is in almost all cases with creative technology that's involved with machine learning other than stable diffusion. And I thought there was a really good example of pushback on that works for me. Like, you know, I don't think copyright is as much as an issue as most artists say, but Holly Herndon and Matt Dryhurst put out a website where you could type in your name or your artwork, and it will show if you're in the stability diffusion, you know, data set or not. And if you are, you can pull yourself out of it. So we have that now. It's like if you're concerned as an artist, you are welcome to pull yourself from the open source data sets. But at the same time, you know, a lot of the way that these algorithms work is it's taking in this data and then it's transforming it in some way. It's not going to be exact. I think we can tell the difference on that. And I've been talking a lot lately too on the other end of this, and maybe Andrew has thoughts on this as well. It's like Grimes just put out this project now. She's a musician, and where she you can use her voice.
Famously ex-wife of Elon Musk.
And Holly Herndon did a project like this as well, and you're seeing more and more of this now. And if you use Grimes' voice and you make money off making music out of that, she gets compensated. So if we really
50-50, allegedly.
Yeah, so if we care about copyright so much, like, why don't artists just let people, and also like the concept of appropriation in artwork is nothing new too. It's like one of the most popular art forms in the 80s, but.
Precisely, it's nothing new, and that's we should talk about it again, but it has become so much more prevalent and obvious, right? Like to train a transformer model on your art, and then, I mean, one of the biggest concerns is this this lawsuit, right? It's going to be very interesting how this ends. It's a class action lawsuit against Stability AI, Midjourney, and DeviantArt that essentially raises legitimate concerns about copyright violation, right? There's a handful of artists that claim that these platforms have trained their models using their art, and now some of their clients essentially refuse to pay them for their art, but rather go to those platforms and just get it for free, like generate an image of that artist, right? So kind of taking the cheap option, the AI-generated option. And
I did want to say one more thing really quickly, is that the issue with creative directors at agencies and brands, at least in the US, of them stealing artists' work and transforming it in some way instead of paying artists.
Long history.
Decades of an issue. And it's not getting any better, and they're definitely going to be using like these machine learning algorithms. So it's just more of the same of that as well. But hopefully we can start exposing that a little more now, you know? But it's not a copyright issue, it's a very human issue.
Yeah, and I think like, yeah, one of the questions, and maybe this is more appropriate for some of the lawyers in the room, right? It was, which I think this will be a panel tomorrow, right? Speaking of which, but you know, there's established precedent. I think the Grimes thing, to bring it up, is a really interesting marketing stunt. You know, that's essentially what it is. Because otherwise, like we have software tools that can isolate stems. So if in fact every artist were to be compensated if they were used for their track, all of a sudden you have John Bonham tracks that are being isolated, and then he gets compensation for every hip hop song that's used his drum tracks. Like, is that the path we're going down? I don't think that's reality, and it just doesn't fit with the established precedent. It doesn't make sense. So I think it's a bit of a non-starter. It's interesting that Grimes was able to get out ahead of that and try and negotiate for 50% of that, but I don't think it's reality. And
she also established the ground rules for the rest to follow, right? She essentially gave a 50% of her agency. Everyone who goes above that market value now is delusional, right? So
I mean, there is an interesting meta question looming in the background, right? Say if I go to a museum and I look at artworks like I can do here, I analyze them, I draw my conclusions from looking at these artworks, and then I go home and I use that information in one of my own artworks. That's normal, standard practice, right? And probably we agree it shouldn't be forbidden. Now, if instead of myself, you know, I'm talking about an artificial neural network that learns from these artworks, all of a sudden it's a question of copyright. I'm not so sure. So I think, I'm not a specialist in the US copyright law, so those claims were being made in the US, maybe they have merit. I think in Europe it would be much harder, because the product of all of this learning and generating, if it is not really similar to the original in a way that it infringes sort of the authority of the original work, then it's not a copyright claim. That's why the German Collecting Society for Music Authors has now published a paper where they say, well, it's right, you're not infringing copyright, but it is a use of our works. So they want it to be a use for which they can then claim revenue, which I think could be a way to go forward. Right?
That's an interesting proposition.
Because even if we as humans, you know, look at an artwork right here, we pay an entrance fee, or maybe not, I don't, you know, but someone is paying for this artwork and the use of looking at it. And the same for music. If we play music now at a party which is public, the person throwing the party has to pay. And that's maybe a fair way forward.
The fair use doctrine, that's actually one of the propositions that's circulating. But in the case, and I have to go back to this because it's it's going to be part of our collective consciousness for a while. In the case of the Drake track, it was not just angst of influence, as Harold Bloom, the cultural historian, said, right? We're all just influence, and everything we consume, nothing is original. What is originality anyways? We're just, you know, a kaleidoscope of influences and other people's work of art. In that case, they emulated his voice, right? It's an AI-generated version of his voice, and it was marketed as a track that he composed. So thus, it was not like, I'm going to do a track that sounds like Drake. You know, everyone does that. That's nothing new. That's it's marketing it as if it were, right? And so, and the artist, who's has a very fun acronym. What was it? I forgot. Anyways. It's part of a whole project called Utope AI, right? And they said this is essentially fan service. So this is really for all the Drake fans out there. So you kind of usurp the whole question of copyright with the fair use doctrine, where you say, I can use certain amount of someone's creative output to you know, create my own art. And as long as it's for educational purposes or, you know, I won't make any money out of it, I can do whatever I want. And thus, these are choppy waters, right? It's a gray area that is very, very hard to navigate.
Yeah, if I were Drake, I would take that song and I would put it on my next album and make a lot of money off it and be the last one laughing.
Only he thinks it's really bad. But other than that.
No, but joking aside, if you brand something with a famous person's name and you're not that person, then you are in the territory of trademark infringement and things like this. And that's
says Universal Music, yeah.
Pretty simple. It's interesting that Universal Music is actually going ahead and suing and trying to stop all of that, instead of working with the people who are, you know, creating all this attention to one of their artists.
I couldn't agree more with that point. But let's leave that conversation behind and tackle like a gazillion other topics that we still want to tackle in the remaining 10 minutes. I want to talk a little bit about education, because this panel is really about like looking outward, looking towards what is ahead, what is on the horizon, what is the future of art. And you can't talk about the future without talking about education. We have an educator in the room. Andrew is leading a group of students at the San Jose University, and I'm really curious to see, I'm guessing all of these are Gen Z or whatever comes next. I don't even know, alpha, beta, whatever. And those young people, first of all, how do they integrate those tools in their artistic practice? Are they frightened? Are they excited? Is this like a make or break moment for them? And what do you, like, as a next question, a follow-up to this one is, how would you educate that next generation to responsibly work with these tools in a creative fashion?
I mean, it's so interesting. I think specifically in the humanities right now, there are a ton of questions coming out as to what the implications of AI mean, like ChatGPT specifically, because it's so broadly accessible into educational space. And like my personal take on it is like we should embrace it and lean wholeheartedly into it, and tell students that it is another tool that's at their disposal, and they still need to do their research and make sure it's good, because now the stakes are higher if their essays are wrong because ChatGPT has hallucinated some facts that are not correct, and I find that, then it's a problem. Or if my students show up with code that they cannot explain the inner workings of it, that's a big problem. And I will call them out, in class, and that's painful for everybody. So I think as far as the near horizon goes, and the sort of trajectory of all this, I personally advocate for the usage in classrooms. I think it's a tool set that's going to be out there that people are going to use. So why don't we take an intelligent approach to it and just integrate these normally as another tool at students' disposal and set the stakes higher, right? Can we actually use it as a way to bolster and make better educational experiences for students? So I have a fairly positivist view of it. I know there are a lot of technologies coming out now in terms of like watermarking and invisible watermarking to make sure that like if you were to put a block of text, say for instance, into a AI checker, it can tell you with fairly good accuracy and certainty if a text has been generated or not. So that's another approach. I don't necessarily think it's so helpful, because I think at the end of the day it's really about meaningful educational experiences and students learning the boundaries of their own knowledge and learning how to be good learners. So if that's another tool to help them do so, and if it's a way to diversify educational experiences, then that seems really meaningful to me. But yeah.
That's a beautiful plaidoyer. Unfortunately, we don't have time, and it's also not the topic of this panel to talk about learning itself. I think we should need a whole symposium on that question and the future of education. But Regina, what's your sense on this?
I think to answer this question, I wanted to shout out Jean Kogan, who is an educator and artist who since 2015 has been offering creatives tools to help them work with machine learning. And those are free tools, like I think they're on GitHub. So if you just like look up Jean Kogan machine learning, they were made specifically to educate artists on what are these technologies, what are different types of algorithms, what are plugins that I could use to play with these, and it very much predates ChatGPT and Stability and Midjourney and all of this. And there's also so many communities right now, even on like Discord, that you can join that are using Midjourney, and artists are helping each other out right now. So for anybody who wants to get educated on this topic, specifically in a creative space, like the resources are there.
Matthias.
Yeah, it's such a fascinating time to be an educator and a learner, I guess. A couple of weeks ago, I tried out a prompt, an AI tutor. It's actually quite an elaborate prompt that I found on GitHub, which asks you about your learning style, the tone of language that the tutor should have, and so on. It's pretty good at prompting GPT-4 this way. And I think it's very potent if you combine it with fine-tuning in certain areas. So for instance, if you say you are a specialist in marine biology, you could create, instead of creating a textbook about your field, you could now create a data set for fine-tuning. A prompt and an ideal answer. 2,000 pairs maybe, and it's a lot of work to do that. You can fine-tune GPT-4, and it will have that knowledge now, and it will, give more accurate answers, and you get an API endpoint that you can give to your students and say, like, use this. And it will have the knowledge of your textbook. I think it's pretty cool,
Can I just follow up with like one more thought about that, because I think it's also, to these points, it really, from my perspective in a pedagogical sense, what I hope my students get out of a class is to become sort of expert builders as opposed to expert users. So I think in terms of like Photoshop, like, yeah, okay, I could teach Photoshop or whatever when I first started, but that's not today, right? And so I'd way rather have my students take a crack at building their own Photoshop from scratch than becoming expert users of Photoshop, right? And I think the same thing is applicable directly to AIs. So what does it mean to get in and train your own models and then take it to the next level and like, you know, start building your own neural lattices? Like that's interesting and it's hard and they're fundamentally good questions though. And so I think there's a really important and interesting learning experience in that.
Yeah, that's a beautiful way to end this. I'm going to end it with a last lightning round. Be as catchy as you can possibly be. I'm going to quote you in the years to come. So, and we're going to start with Matthias. What does the future of art look like?
Future of art.
What else? What else is there?
I think the future of art will be very individualistic because, you know, it's going to be relatively easy to get a really snappy, groovy track with your guitar from the AI, so you better make it special. Yeah.
I like it. It's very catchy.
I mean, the future of art is the past of art, at least since the 20th century or the late 19th century. It's this idea of responding to the culture that you're embedded within and society. And I said subversion earlier. It's like artists have a special place in society with their ability to express themselves visually and sonically in ways that you can't just do verbally, at least visual artists, to communicate to a specific time and a specific group of people. So they'll continue to be critical and at the same time engaged with emerging technologies, not just machine learning, but there's in a sense it's like nothing new, and AI is not providing anything new in that way.
It's all new and nothing new. All right, Andrew.
Yeah, I think
wrap this up.
Yeah, what do I say after all that? The future of art, I don't know. It's so contextual, right? Like we're all products and creatures of our time, and I think art will continue to evolve as human and the human existence continues to evolve, right? So that's what I would think.
Bravo. Thank you three so much for this conversation. And this gives us some time for a Q&A, so please feel free to ask some questions. I'm going to hand around the mic to make sure that everyone's heard. So do we have some questions in the audience? I see one hand being raised. Do we have an additional microphone? Yes. Here we go. Could you please hand it over to the gentleman sitting in row 3?
Thank you. I just wanted to make a comment about the copyright issue, which is extremely difficult. In 2016, I called up the creators of the Creative Commons license, and I told them we should add a logo to say, don't include in a model. They had no idea what I was talking about. And in fact, I wonder if he could do that again, call them now, hopefully. They will, yeah, I mean, the problem here is the following. They wouldn't even know what to do because they're lawyers, and they would have to actually explain in law terms what it means to put something into a model. And it turns out society's real way of handling this is to do class action lawsuits, and if you're in the US.
Create a precedent. Yeah.
And that's what it is.
At least in the US, for
sure. So, yeah, if you want to change things, we have to go the typical routes. I think that's what it is, but I'm happy to hear you comment on that.
I can totally support what you just said. In 2020, I did some negotiations for a well-known artist for a new contract. And I said, well, we got to put in there that you cannot use the records for machine learning purposes. And they're like, what are you talking about? This is some of your crazy future stuff. It's not going to happen. Well, we have it in the contract now, thanks God. But it was a hard piece of work.
Very smart. Any other questions? Gentleman in the back?
Thank you, and thank you for this great panel. My question is, do you think there might be some rebellion against digital art, and people want to go back to physical art, like oil paintings or sculptures, because there's going to be this tsunami of digital content, and most of it will be bad. So do you think physical art will be, trendy again?
The classic traditionalist backlash wouldn't be the first time. Regina?
It's already happening. So teenagers now in like high schools, at least in the United States, are doing point-and-click cameras again. Film cameras, the ones you just like used to buy from the convenience store. And it's their way of rebelling. They're getting more interested in analog processes and machinery. And then there's even art fairs, like there's an art fair called New Art Dealers Association. And 2 years ago, there was no even video art. And despite the fact that we talk so much about emerging technology in the arts, it's still not really selling. Even video art is still not really selling the same way that traditional painting and sculpture is. It remains the dominant art form.
Yeah, we haven't even tackled the question of tokenization and marketing of digital arts. I mean, that's a whole different area, and why it's so difficult to
But I will say
monetize.
also, that we do see a lot of physical processes and people moving away from the screens as well. So a lot of times, I think there's a heavy bias to understand digital art as anything screen-based, which is not the case, right? So when you look at processes of like 3D printing and computer-aided manufacturing, this type of thing, that's also a rising trend where it might not be inherent, the digital processes that go into the work, but ultimately there is digital intervention in most of these processes, unless they are explicitly like processing a film or like really old school alternative processes within these spaces. So,
and just as a side note, we created something with an AI, then turned it into a physical score that people could put on their desks, and they played it on wooden instruments to record it and turn it back into a digital recording that you can now listen on Spotify. So it's a complete mix of all modes of creation, I think.
Yeah, and that leads us to the hybridization of this interesting time that we're living, for sure. Anyone has any more questions? Yes, go ahead. Do you want a microphone? Danke, Christoph.
Yeah, I was very interested to hear of the Beethoven project, which I'd read about, but I got the impression, however impressive the work was, in the end it was rather sterile. In other words, that because there was no person behind it, if you like, a soul behind it, there was no transcendent value. And I'm not sure whether digital art can ever get to that level of transcendence where you don't know why it's going wow to you, but it does, yeah? Because it's beyond words, it's beyond logic, it's beyond rationality. Yeah? Whereas artificial intelligence or augmented intelligence is always based on a kind of rational basis.
Well, I can't really answer that question because only you can. When that happens, if you like it or not, I can say that in our process there were a lot of humans involved, and maybe to give some context, when you look at the sketches that Beethoven left, he was very clear in that he wanted to have something that is very different from the Ninth Symphony. The Ninth being about universality, the big humanity questions, very big also in scoring. In his sketches for the 10th, he's actually going back to very early music of his own. He's talking about chorales, he's talking about spirituality. So some of what you experienced can be part of that, but also the material that he left was very rudimentary. So, you're missing out on the whole development of these ideas that he would do when he started composing. None of that is there. So I would agree with you that there is a difference between a finished composition of Beethoven that he had wrestled with for 3 years and what we wrestled with for 3 years. But nevertheless, I think the question of whether you are overwhelmed by something or not is precisely part of your perception of it. And just one last sentence, we always have a little game where we play a piece of music and it starts with exactly what Beethoven wrote down in the sketches, and then at some point the AI takes over and we let people decide by showing hands when they think it is. No one can find it. I mean, it's really amazing. And so then, when you've done that game, it becomes really hard for you to criticize what you're hearing because you can't really tell the difference. Yeah.
I think a lot is also like the myth of the author, the myth of the artist, how we attribute so much magical qualities to the authorship and just this person behind the art piece that has always been inherently, intrinsically part of the artistic journey of, since the beginning of time. But I think what your comment is very, very, very timely. A lot of people have the same sensation, let's have you first, and then there's a gentleman in the white t-shirt.
If I may, I would like to elaborate a little bit on the point that you just made concerning the individuality. So I'm doing some writing on art as a profession. So of course I was very anxious to find out what ChatGPT could give me or what it would do. And I must say, at this stage, very disappointed. Because
you're the first one to tell me that.
Because what you get from ChatGPT is never an opinion, and it is never transparent about any facts. It just it all remains very diffuse. And once you've started asking questions, and you get really to the complicated questions, like, can you give me a specific example? It begins to get difficult. And sometimes it even says, oh, we have a technical problem now. And so I'm not very much afraid that this program will take away my job. I mean, it can be used because it can assemble several general ideas which you might not have thought before. For instance, I posed the question, if a British punk band plays reggae and wears dreadlocks, is that cultural appropriation? And then the answer is, this is a very controversial subject, blah, 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 and you get several points. Some argue this, some argue that. And so this is something I knew
supposed to have
before.
an opinion, yeah.
I mean, very difficult. And
did it send you a bill about legal services?
Yeah, it's not supposed to have an opinion, but I think this is a great way to segue into our next panel, where we will tackle much more in-depth the question of ChatGPT and its path to AGI, where I think it would be convenient to talk about that. But let's wrap this Q&A up with one last question, because you raised your arm a couple of minutes back. And then thank you all for your time.
Thank you. I have just one question, and that's regarding, we are talking about generative AI and the future of art. And my question is a bit like, when you ask what art is and what is big art, it's usually art that's also really old. So when you look back at the biggest art that you can find in the cathedrals and statues, that's like all very old art. And sometimes I'm asking, especially about the digital art, how long can it really last? So sometimes I feel like we are talking about art today, but maybe in 10 years from now, nobody will even remember, and it's like just a click in the air, and it's like, okay, that's it. What do you think about that?
Oh, I'm going to let you handle that question.
I feel like Regina should address this, but I don't know.
I mean, I don't know what to say. There's a whole field of media arts that started in the late 1950s. So there's been artists that have been working with emerging technologies. If you don't even count the 19th century and proto-photography and pre-cinema, if you want to count like digital technologies, it starts in the late 1950s, and you have thousands and thousands of artists over these decades who have made work. I am both a curator and a time-based media conservator, which means that my job is also to create documentation that helps this artwork live on into the future. It's like when you purchase a painting, you have to make sure that it's under certain temperature control and humidity and conditions, right? I do that for digital art, basically. Makeup, the reality is that most digital artwork is vulnerable, right? It's vulnerable to time, and it requires instructions for migration and asking artists how they want the work to exist in the future. It's a whole field. It's a whole complicated field. But, you know, a lot of us ask ourselves when it comes to contemporary art in general, or art history as a whole, what works are timeless, right? And that has less to do with medium at all, whether it's digital or analog, painting, sculpture, uses machine learning. It's about concept, it's about thoughtfulness, and it's relationship to a period in time. And people like us, curators, conservators, we're going to choose what works end up in textbooks in the future. And there's already textbooks on digital art.
Yeah, I think this is a great moment to stop this conversation and not add anything else. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Matthias. Thank you, Regina. And thank you, Andrew.